Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to the ASCE, the Association for the Study of the Cuban Economy. We generally have one session each year at the AEA. Generally, it's a small session. Comments are welcome. So we have this is a meeting format, so you can actually ask questions after each presentation. We have 3 papers today, and rather than just go through what they are, let's start. Our first paper is from Lewis. It's on a very important topic, maybe a central topic for the Cuban economy. It's the impact of the reforms that started almost a year ago today. So what we'll do is Lewis will speak for a half an hour, and then I will give some quick comments, and then we'll throw it open to the audience. This is an important topic, and I hope some people have comments. So Lewis, take it away.
Thank you, John. And first, let me thank ASCE for inviting me to this session and for the opportunity to present my current work on some topics that are relevant now and will probably be relevant for the long term. So let me share screen here. All right, so my paper will be on Cuba, dollarization, and devaluation. Initially, I had thought about speaking about dollarization, devaluation, and inflation, but I began thinking what Robert Solow used to say: people who try to explain everything don't explain anything. So I will keep to these 2 wide subjects. The inception of this was dollarization. I was always puzzled by dollarization in Cuba because it's quite a peculiar form of dollarization, as I will explain later. But it's not possible to speak about dollarization without considering the overall external environment, and particularly the exchange rate. So as it turns out, Cuba has just undergone at the beginning of this year, of last year, of 2021, a maxi devaluation. So actually the context of dollarization and devaluation becomes very relevant. So let me explain the outline of the paper. I will speak first about the context, and the context is of a chronic balance of payments crisis and dollarization, which in one form or another has been going on in Cuba for over the last decade. Then I will talk a little bit about what I call the dollar crunch in 2019-21, where severe scarcity of foreign exchange and dollars has presented severe constraints on the economy. And then I talk a little bit about a simple rational expectations model that takes into account the dual currency system in Cuba. Up to the beginning of 2021, Cuba had 2 domestic currencies. One, the Cuban peso, the other one is the convertible peso. So we essentially had a dual currency system, besides the dollar being used as a mechanism to perform transactions and as a store of value. So since 2021, the beginning of 2021, currency unification took place, but the country still has a dual exchange rate system. So I will talk about that briefly at one point. Now I extend the model to analyze the funding of dollarization through remittances. The way that dollarization in Cuba is funded is mostly through remittances. There are some other sources through through tourism and a tiny bit of private exports, but the bulk of it is funded through remittances from relatives abroad. Then I will talk a little bit about the maxi devaluation of January 1st, 2021. And then in the absence of detailed monetary data, I look at indicators of dollarization since 2011 and the question of how dollar prices are set in the economy. Now, about the current context, Cuba has had a structural balance of payments crisis going on for a long time. And this derives from a problem with exports. This being a long-term decline in exports, and which continues. And also, the crisis has been aggravated by the collapse of the Venezuelan economy, which essentially provided Cuba with a significant amount of revenue from Cuba's exports of health and other services to the Venezuelan economy. As the Venezuelan economy collapsed after 2015, these exports essentially were not converted into a flow of income for the Cuban government. And now it's very difficult to track some of these movements, but I look at the bottom line. The bottom line is what happens to imports, because imports are essentially the budget constraints. So we see that looking at the last 10 years, that imports per year peaked around 14 billion in 2013, and since have declined and essentially halved last year, 2020, from the peak in 2013. And this is sort of the budget constraint. It's been essentially a halving of resources available for imports. Now, the data for 2021 indicates it's been leveling off. I don't have it here, but it seems that it may have reached a temporary plateau here. And the reasons are not completely clear, but one important is that the price of nickel has really boomed, and Cuba is a significant exporter of nickel. There's been a tiny bit of improvement in tourism, but essentially still imports have plateaued at half the level of 2013. Now this is the line for merchandise exports. We don't see the 2021 number here. There's been a bit of a plateau here too, compensated by nickel, which offset decline in other Cuban exports such as sugar, tobacco, and minor manufacturing goods. Now, this is the result of the dollar crunch. There are long lines and stores. Food is scarce, and imports have also been hit by the fact that food prices, imported food prices, are up around 15% if you look at U.S. food price producer price indices. And Cuba now actually has become a fairly important importer of some U.S. food products. So the result is a very dire situation in terms of the supply of basic goods in Cuba. Shelves are empty and so forth. Now, what I try to do is to provide a simple model to make sense of dollarization and in the context of the external accounts. And I have the simple model is it's a model of currency substitution. There are basically three assets: CUP, which are Cuban pesos; CUC, the old convertible pesos, which are disappearing. They haven't completely disappeared yet, but mostly disappeared by the beginning of last year, and dollars. Now, portfolio decisions, this is a portfolio selection model, and they depend on returns on the assets and expectations about the exchange rate. The supply of dollars comes from the current account. In this case, the important part of the current account are remittances or transfers. And the current account is driven by the real exchange rate and remittances. Now, I'm not going to go into the details. It's a simple model with 5 equations, but one of the key equations is the portfolio demand for dollars, E is the exchange rate, DR dollars, and it's a function of the returns of the 3 assets and expectations of the change in the exchange rate. And this is a wealth constant, which is equivalent to the holdings of the currencies. Now, the model can be solved for the expected change in the exchange rate. I use the asterisk as the first difference, and it's a function of the holdings of the 3 currencies. Dollars in domestic equivalent, and then in this case the 2 currencies. One would be in the Cuban case the peso and the cook. Now, this model follows a long tradition of these kinds of models, and I'm just applying it to the Cuban case. Now, a simple way to look at the model is to look at the equilibrium conditions. This is the exchange rate expectations, where essentially expected change in the exchange rate is 0, and this is essentially the current account, where the flow of dollars is equal to 0. And essentially what happens, what happens when we have shocks, like the ones Cuba has been experiencing because of 2 things, the pandemic and US restrictions on Cuban trade and finance that were tightened during the Trump administration. So the impact of the shock is a shift in our current account equation, and these are equilibrium exchange rates. Now, remember, in Cuba we have 2 currencies and multiple exchange rates, so this implies the equilibrium rate, and we have a shock, and then we essentially would move the equilibrium rate. These are the exchange rates in terms of domestic currency per dollar, so that we would essentially would move from A to B, implying an devaluation of the exchange rate. And this is essentially what one could observe if we had precise data about the equilibrium exchange rate. We don't, but we do have rates about the 2 currency rates in the official market and the parallel market in Cuba, the black market. So this is the simple explanation of what happens. Now, because there are currencies, and one is we call the C, or the Cuban case would be the convertible peso, and M, the Cuban peso. These 2 currencies trade internally at a constant internal rate, which we call K, and which is essentially set by the central bank. The central bank essentially converts one currency into the other at a current internal rate. In the Cuban case, has been 24-to-1. So we can look at the holdings of both currencies at the internal exchange rate. And what's going on is that the government, beginning in 2020, began to make the currency C, the cook, less attractive by putting restrictions on its use and essentially advertising or announcing that there would be a currency unification. So what's been going on is that we've had a shift. Oh, sorry. Of the cook curve upwards, the blue curve, and the peso one here. And this is how currency unification takes place. And the Cuban government announced that on January 1st, 2021, the currency will be converted from one currency, the convertible peso, to the Cuban peso. And this process was supposed to take place over 3 months. In practice, most of it took place over 3 months. But this being a residual, which hasn't yet been converted and is held in the system, but over 90%, well over 90% has been converted through this process. This is the currency unification part. So now what about the mechanics of dollarization in Cuba? Well, this is what makes dollarization in Cuba quite peculiar. And dollarization essentially means that people hold dollars or a hard currency to protect themselves against instability, either inflation or exchange rate changes. And essentially, the usual ways that people have hold deposits of dollars in the banking system, the domestic banking system. Now in Cuba, dollars must be deposited in special accounts in Cuban banks. But these accounts, these deposits are not convertible back into dollars and are mostly used to purchase merchandise in special so-called MLC dollar stores, which are a monopoly of the state for imported appliances. The scheme is designed to capture remittances. Now the model has to be extended to account for this. So we changed the current account equation to have a function for relative dollar pricing in Cuba. That is domestic dollar prices, that is dollar prices in Cuba versus the equivalent international price. So in this case, then we come up with a simple scheme where we have the current account equation and then have the expectations for the exchange rate. But now we can see them as a function of the relative dollar prices prevailing in Cuba and prevailing. So we may be at a point like B where there may be a current account deficit and a fixed exchange rate because there was a devaluation. But in both instances, before and after the devaluation, the exchange rate was fixed. So it may not be an equilibrium rate, which would be A. So we can now look at the model in terms of a new variable, which is the prices, the relative prices in dollar terms. Now, to simplify matters about the exchange rate, we can look at a time series for the last 11 years. And so we have, in this case, instead of looking at the currency, I'm just looking at the official and the parallel rates. So so this being a fixed pegged official exchange rate at 1 Cuban peso or CUP per dollar until the end of 2020. And then it was devalued at the beginning of last year to an exchange rate of 24 to 1. At the same time, the parallel rate essentially was pretty much stable until the end of 2019 at 24 to 1. And then we began to see a devaluation in the parallel market. And this was brought about by I want to get into the details about expansive fiscal policy. And so before the devaluation, we already, official devaluation, we already had movement in the parallel rate. But during this long period, we could have said that expectations about the exchange rate were relatively stable although this began to evidently change in 2020. By mid-September 2021, the parallel rate was 27. So there was a huge gap between the official rate and the parallel rate. And we can see that in the average rate as well. And essentially, the economy has had an average devaluation of about 830% in 2021, which in the context of devaluations, this is a truly maxi devaluation. Which has created a number of interesting dynamics, which I'm not analyzing at this point, but this is what's going on with the exchange rates. Now, what happens with dollarization? We do not have monetary data on Cuba, except for an aggregate, an M2A aggregate, and an aggregate for currency. But we don't have information on foreign currency deposits in the banking system. So we have to look at some proxies to gauge dollarization. One proxy is a what may call a transaction indicator, and this is household consumption in private businesses. Now, some of these transactions take place in dollars. Some others used to take place in the old convertible peso, which is disappearing or has practically vanished. But we don't know exactly what the proportion of transactions in dollars or in the convertible, so-called convertible peso were. But essentially, we've had a large development in the private sector that implies a widening use of the dollar as a transaction mechanism. Now, dollar supply indicators. Again, we don't have data on dollar deposits in the banking system. We do have data from the Bank of International Settlements on Cuban banks' deposits in international banks in dollar terms, so that this ordinarily would be the counterpart of domestic dollar deposits. So it gives us a sense of what's happening to the to holdings in effective dollars, not in paper dollars, in the sense that as these dollar accounts in the Cuban system are essentially non-convertible, then they surely can overstate the counterpart. In other words, the backup in international banks. But we've seen now a halving of dollar deposits in international banks from Cuban banks. Now, this is consistent with the model. I need to go back to the first graphic that I had, where when we have shocks, the supply of dollars goes down, and essentially we have dollarization in terms of dollars actually shrinks, but because of movements in the exchange rate, dollarization in local currency terms has probably increased. So here we are looking at dollarization in dollar terms. When we look at the exchange rate movement in domestic currency terms, this is quite different. Now, this is important because, according to the model, expectations about the exchange rate take place because of relative holdings of dollars in domestic value terms versus domestic currency. Now, another indicator of dollar supply is that visits by expatriates peaked in 2019 and then collapsed with the pandemic, and also due to travel restrictions from the US. Now, this is important because remittances in kind come mainly from visits by expatriates. who essentially bring dollar currency. Cuba has also very recently imposed restrictions on the use of dollars in the special dollar accounts. One cannot deposit dollar currency anymore. As the government says that it cannot deposit these dollars in foreign banks because of US restrictions. And therefore, expatriates who bring currency to Cuba must bring euros or Canadian dollars or pound sterling or some non-dollar currency to deposit them in these special accounts. Now, what happens is that the special accounts are non-convertible, as I explained. They can be converted into domestic currency, but not into dollars. And they essentially exist to be used in the special dollar accounts. So Cuba has a network of special dollar stores. We sell appliances and more foodstuffs, imported foodstuffs, and even some local foodstuffs using these dollar accounts. So essentially, they are very rigid, and it is important to know what happens in these stores. So these stores are called MLC stores, which means freely convertible currency stores. And these stores are a monopoly of the state, so that they are the only stores that sell imported appliances and freely imported foodstuffs, as opposed to the state stores where people can buy using essentially a ration book. These MLC stores are a monopoly of the state, and they set prices as a monopoly. Presumably, they have quite a bit of market power, and we can look at this by comparing 4 items that are sold in this MLC store with a comparable Walmart price in the US. And so we can see the 4 items here, which are the ones that can be compared. There are many other items, but it's very difficult to compare them, as these are often unknown brands, or they're unbranded, or maybe Chinese products that will have an easy equivalent. But so we can look at the difference between price and marginal cost. I use as marginal cost the average marginal cost of Walmart, which is derived from Walmart's annual report. And then we look at the learner index, which is essentially this one over the price. It's a measure of the gross margin. So we see that these items have a gross margin over 50%. Now, the average gross margin for Walmart is 27%. So essentially, the MLC stores have a gross margin which is about a little bit over twice the Walmart margin. Now, from the learning index, we can calculate the implied elasticity of demand, and as a monopoly would expect that the more inelastic product, which is rice, would have the highest margin, which is what we anticipate. So what does this mean? It means that we have a system where dollarization depends, this peculiar dollarization, which dollarization in rigid accounts depends on the pricing element of the stores, which have quite a bit of monopoly power. Now, ideally, we would want to test what this differential pricing does to remittances. And we know that remittances have been going down, but they've been going down because of variable factors, and we cannot easily disentangle it. Now, I am going to end by just talking a little bit about what we found out. So we have a currency substitution model that illustrates the impact of shocks on dollarization and the exchange rate. Currency unification proceeded pretty smoothly, as indicated in the model. This is a mechanical part that was the only part of what we call the monetary reform that Cuba undertook that has worked smoothly. Now, dollarization and remittances are impacted by foreign shocks and monetary rigidity in Cuba. So both variables have an impact, and the foreign shocks include both things like the pandemic, the Venezuelan collapse, the Trump sanctions, and then we have monetary rigidity in Cuba. Prices in dollar stores indicate monopoly pricing, while remittances and dollars deposits received. The impact of monopoly dollar pricing is uncertain. And I'll stop here.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Louis. So I will give my comments now. Hopefully, they'll do. I'll get through them pretty quickly, and we'll allow some time for questions. Carol, can I? Okay, so let me just. I have to share screen. Carol, could you allow me to share the screen, please? Carol, I'm not. Is Carol there?
John.
Yes.
You can share the screen from your own.
Yeah, no, I'm trying. I can't share.
But you're a co-host. You're a co-host.
Okay, I should be able to do it. Thanks, Louis. No, it's not allowing me to share the screen.
Oh, how about that? I can do mine. So
you, yeah, they haven't. Okay. Well, that makes it hard. But anyway, let me try and go through it as quickly as possible. Again, is Carol here? Okay, so that'll be even quicker than I planned. So what I really want to say about Lewis's paper is what happened in Cuba is just extraordinary. This is one of the largest maxi devaluations ever. Okay, and it takes place, I mean, in a profound economic crisis. We haven't seen anything like this in Cuba since the special period. And there are two things that I want to say before I discuss these papers. Economists are generally agreed on what needs to be done in such economic crisis. I mean, the literature starts from in the 1950s with Mundell and Johnson. It was the idea that you had to reduce spending relative to income. Now, there's a bunch of economists called the Australians that was sort of brought into mainstream by Rudiger Dornbusch, said you also needed a big change in relative prices to sort of induce increased production in tradables. That's a real exchange rate depreciation. So for it to be successful, the Cubans had to have a real exchange rate depreciation and a reduction in absorption. So I want to put that out front before I discuss Lewis's paper. Now, I'm afraid it's a pity I don't have the slides, but I want to say something about Lewis's paper. Over the last year, Lewis has been doing pretty much the Chronicles of Reform. As I count them, he has 6 papers. All of these papers are essential to understanding what has happened in Cuba. And he goes through sort of the main characteristics. Now, what I want to also say about Lewis is that he's doing research in an area where either the data is either not available or you have to construct your own. And in many cases, you saw some of this in this paper. Lewis has pretty much constructed his own data, right? Which is pretty remarkable in itself. And throughout the papers, not just this, there are these remarkable things for macro or micro people. For example, Lewis in an earlier paper, within Cuba, there's a very large spread in the free black market exchange rate between various exchange rates, between the euro and the dollar. That's very large. And that's remarkable. He talks a little bit in this paper about the sort of the trade in bank accounts in dollars. He talks also about monopolies. And all these things are remarkable, and Lewis has got data. Now, the bottom line is, I learned a lot from this paper. I agree with most of it. So what I'm going to do is maybe amplify a little bit of what Lewis said, and maybe I'll disagree in 2 points. Okay. The first is, how bad is the situation? I don't have the slides, but one way to do it, and that Lewis mentioned this a little bit, is to look at imports. What I do is I look at imports per capita since 2000. And what's important here is divide by population, but also adjust for changes in the price level. So what I did is I took UNTAD deflators. If you look at this, and you can also use the directional trade. If you look at this, last year, imports were below, say, 2000, before when Venezuela starts giving aid. In other words, we're not at the special period, but we're not that far off. So I think that the maybe Lewis maybe understated the series. Well, it's hard to, he did have to understate the series of this. Now, the second thing is, and again, I apologize for no slides, is that Lewis talks about the dollar crunch as driving the parallel rate. The dollar crunch is Venezuela pretty much stopped giving aid. There's the COVID and tourism. There is also maybe remittances. I'll talk to that a little bit. But I think there's something else. And Lewis mentioned this in passing. In the last couple of years, the Cubans have been running deficits of 15% of GDP. How are they financing this? They can't finance it out of dollar deposits that much. So presumably, it's in production of domestic money. So if you put in domestic money to Lewis's model, you'll get 2 explanations. You'll get the dollar crunch, but you'll also get the the domestic monetary impetus. And I think that's important. Now, and that also is, what is also important to remember is that the Cuban devaluation pretty much wiped out the internal value of the domestic currency. This was a big windfall to the Cuban government, right? This is an important part of their revenue. Okay, and I think if you build that into the model, I don't think it will change any Lewis conclusions, but I think it plays some role. And then that brings us to remittances. There are actually estimates from the Economist Intelligence Unit for remittances. Okay, and if you see them, they're actually pretty dramatic. Around 2008, they start increasing dramatically. And when you look at this, you wonder, are these remittances, or they are they investment, right? Are they investment in stores, in homes, stuff like that? If they really are investment, then Cuba is potentially looking for a drop in remittances. Okay, now, and I think this is the important point that I would say that I would differ a little bit from Lewis. For the Cuban devaluation to be successful, they have to have a real devaluation, and potentially a major real devaluation. There are other sources of price data from Cuba. There's something called Numbeo, which is a crowdsourced data. If you look at that, those data, and this is one of the implications of Lewis's model, you will see that the Cuban price level has increased by maybe 20% relative to the Dominican Republic in dollar terms in the last year or so. That the Cuban price level is actually high relative to other countries, higher than China, not that far off Russia. If this is true, the various reforms, the increase in public sector prices, the big increases in prices in dollar stores have raised the Cuban price level. So far from producing a devaluation, it's produced a real appreciation, right? Again, the data are not good, but I think that's one possibility. And you can actually look at prices in Havana and Santo Domingo, and you see that in virtually all areas, food prices are higher now, corresponding to what Lewis said, in Havana than anywhere in the Caribbean. Of course, other things are even more expensive, like jeans. Another thing that's very puzzling about Cuba is why are rents so high in Havana, right? And these are the rents paid by Cubans, and you can actually see them. Is Carol? I guess Carol has never been here. Okay. So I'll summarize in 3 ways since I don't have slides. Okay. The official rate differs enormously from the free exchange rate. We don't know for sure, but the real exchange rate appears to have appreciated. Third, to engineer a current account balance, you need to control the fiscal deficit. That appears to have gotten worse, and considerably so, in the last year. If that's the case, then the reforms have not worked. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about remittances. Okay, you can form a simple model of remittances where there are people in Cuba sending money to Havana or to Cuba. And so you can have a model where for the people in Florida, the rest of the US, perhaps Spain, their utility depends on their own utility plus the utility of people in Cuba. And then if it's closed model, you can have the utility of people in Cuba depend only on the utility of people in Cuba. Lewis will recognize this because that's just the Gary Becker model, right, of altruism. It turns out in that model, right, if you have the Cubans raise the prices in dollar stores because it reduces the income of people in Cuba, you can actually have an increase in remittance. Okay, since and you can have a little model stuff like that. So since I don't have slides, I will close on that. So I'll open it. Does anybody have what Lewis maybe can reply, and then we'll see if there are any questions.
I have some comments if you want to.
Okay, I mean, it's an informal meeting, so Lewis, would you?
Yeah, I'm not going to comment so much on the general ideas of the paper, since you guys are much more knowledgeable than I am about anything to do with exchange rates and so forth. I did want to point out that on the model you just mentioned, I wrote one up for ASCE some years back, exactly along those lines. And I did want to comment on the microeconomics sort of these dollar prices. One of the problems that the regime always has is that remittances, when they started allowing remittances back in the early 90s, the remittances go totally to the recipient, and therefore they create an enormous distributional crisis for the regime. And so if they tax them very heavily coming in, then they will simply seek out a black market to come into Cuba. So the alternative, which they hit upon, I think, is to have the dollar stores with monopoly power. And that led to this monopoly pricing. If they reduce that monopoly pricing, they make the transmission of remittances maybe or maybe not more attractive, but in any case, the problem they have is that it worsens the distributional crisis that they have, and that creates political problems for them. So I think they're kind of in a bind, not really able to, to do that very much. What I estimated in the past was that something like 2/3 or more of the remittances were being captured by the government. So I think that those high monopoly prices are kind of essential to them. That's all. One thing, John, I don't know if it'll work if Carol doesn't come back, but I think if you send me,
I've sent you my slides, Lewis,
and maybe I can play them and you can talk over them. I'll take a look and see if I can find it.
Lewis, do you want to reply?
Yes, just a quick comment on. Thank you very much, John, for your perceptive comments, and I agree actually with your comments. I am pretty well aware of the fiscal problem, and in 2021, the fiscal deficit is supposed to be over 20% of GDP. So essentially, and this began before, so that's why we had the result in the parallel markets began to experience a devaluation in 2020, and so we had the fiscal boom before the devaluation, which is the wrong thing to do. I mean, you want to constrain their fiscal policy while they were expanding it. Inflation, I have a paper on inflation, and yeah, I mean, the problem is that the government numbers are based on prices in state stores, so they claim they have 70% inflation year to date. But this is because they are recording only the state stores, which have actually top price, maximum prices. They have guidelines or a maximum price. When one looks at the private markets, and if you look at the mechanics of the evaluation, you cannot have 830% evaluation, where the prices at the port are up 830% in local currency terms, and then have 70% inflation domestically, simply because something has been broken down. But underlying all of that, there is a fiscal and monetary problem. Now, remittances, I think that are very interesting, and I think Luis Locai's comments are also very interesting. Yeah, the question is whether monopoly pricing, they designed the stores as a way to capture remittances. And Raul Castro said so. We have created the stores to capture the dollars. Essentially, it's a dollar catching mechanism. But what happens is, as Luis Locai mentioned, is that you have a black market. And if you have monopoly pricing, and you can still have relatives bring goods into Cuba, they will bring them. They will have remittances in kind. Now, I don't think we really know very well what remittances flows are, because the data is not very good, and there are many estimates. I myself made some of them, but I come up with a huge confidence interval when I look at it. So it goes up, I mean, it's a huge interval, so we don't really know for sure. And although we know it's significant, and we can use comparative data to get some sense of it. So we have to look at other indicators, and we don't have any. This data is secret. The data about the size of the these dollar accounts, so-called dollar accounts in Cuba, is a state secret. So we don't really know what they are. I mean, they do know, but I don't know. And now, yeah. So this is it. I think that the question about the monopoly power is complex. And they think, my sense is that if you have a monopoly pricing, why would anyone send money? And you can see anecdotally that people say, I'm sending money to Cuba, and my cousin has to go and pay a huge premium for these goods. My answer is to try to send them the goods, or go into some kind of black market. But we don't really know. Essentially, there are necessities. So yes, there's an element. Yes, but they have to eat, and if that's the only way they can get some essential goods, then they will pay the markup, the high margin. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Okay. Any comments or?
I have a minor comment. This mechanism for the dollar stores reminds me of colonial Africa marketing boards, where the colonial powers forced farmers to sell all of the product to a marketing board at very low prices, and then they sold it at monopoly prices. They had a monopoly, and the main consequence of that was a disincentive for farmers to produce. And so in this context, it seems that it's a disincentive for people to send remittances. And fantastic paper, by the way, and comments.
No, thank you.
Okay, so I guess we'll thank you, Louis, and we'll go on to our next Louis. So Louis, take it away.
Okay, you're gonna go from Lewis squared to Lewis 1. Okay, let's see. All right. Okay, can you see the slides now, John?
Yes, I can see the slides.
Okay, great. All right, so I actually presented a version of this at a I think Roger was the discussant at that time. This one is I've written it only in the last few days, actually the last few weeks. John has not had much time to review it, but and it's still somewhat preliminary. But the work that's leading up to it has been going on for several years. Here's the basic background for it. Prior to John and Marianne Ward's article, which they call WD, their Journal of Economic History article in 2012, we did not have PPP adjusted measures of income or output for Cuba prior to the revolution, which makes any sort of pre and post-revolutionary comparisons pretty difficult. What they estimated was that in 1955, per capita GDP was about 27% that of the US, and that consumption was about 35% that of the US. And both of these estimates, in their opinions, were conservative. That is, they had to make several assumptions, and they tend to make assumptions that would lead to lower estimates rather than higher ones. Now, since then, other estimates have been put forth. I guess one of the better known ones, at least, comes from a well-known and well-used data set, which is the Madison project database. I'm using the 2020 version, and they supposedly have a whole time series for many countries, but including Cuba, of per capita GDP. They don't have consumption numbers, but their estimates are much lower. In 1955, their estimate for per capita GDP was 15%, as opposed to 27%, so almost half of the WD estimate. And for 1957, which is the year that I used, it was 17% of the US. Now, the procedure here in this paper is to, first of all, use 1957. Why 57? Because I wanted to use something that was close to the revolution. I'm sorry, something that was close to the revolution, but that was it was a few years before, so things were not distorted by the revolution itself. So that's why I used 1957. I thought that was 2 years away, and so that would be a good base. The procedure is going to be basically to look at various socioeconomic indices where we have data for Cuba and for many other countries, and to sort of compare what sort of income levels are implied by those socioeconomic indices relative to other countries for which we think we know what they're, for which we have at least estimates, PPP adjusted estimates of their income levels. And so here's just a table that shows some of these results for a few countries. I use the indices above the black line. I have other indices that I have data for, including the ones that I show here of TVs, newspapers, and schooling. And I didn't use those three and others because of missing values. I wanted to have a large number of countries, and those would reduce my number of countries by, I don't know, 10, 20. And I didn't want to do that. I have since reevaluated this notion, and if I have time, I'll discuss that at the very end. But anyway, here's Cuba. Here's the average of my data set. This is for the US. I put in 3 countries from Latin America: Costa Rica, Dominican Republic, and Venezuela. Madison reports for Costa Rica a higher income per capita, significantly higher than Cuba in 1957. The DR is lower, but basically about 40% lower. And Venezuela, it appears as something like 3 times the income of Cuba that they give for Cuba. But if you look at these indices, it is not those are not reasonable income figures that they give. For example, in everything that I have here, from phones to life expectancy, radios, infant mortality rate, doctors, dentists, total fertility rate, cars, electricity consumption, kilocalories, Cuba exceeds not just the DR, but it actually, by exceed, I mean they have measures that we associate with higher income. Those of Costa Rica, things like the infant mortality rate is almost 1/2. Doctors per capita is something like 4 times. In terms of cars, televisions, even telephones, they tend to range from either just a bit above it to many times higher. In fact, it's even higher than for most indices for Venezuela, with the exception of, I think, electricity and cars. Cuba ranks better in these socioeconomic indices. So the numbers the income numbers that or GDP numbers that Madison is giving for Cuba do not seem to be reasonable when you look across all these indices. And if you add the ones that I've excluded, it doesn't really change the picture very much either. And so that's for just for those countries. But if you look at the country as a world as a whole, I've done the following. I just picked 4 of them just to give you an idea. So what these are on the horizontal axis of all these 4 graphs are going to be is going to be log of GDP per capita according to Madison, with the exception of Cuba. And the vertical axis will be some log of the index that we're measuring. In this case, it's going to be the log of phones per 1,000 persons over 18. And so the sample countries are all given here. For example, this is Venezuela. This is the DR. The yellow one here is Costa Rica. And the purple one is the US. The black line is a regression of logs on logs. So it's a log, linear in logs. And the blue dots are all the other countries. As you can see, quite a decent fit. And if you take Cuba's number of phones and you find out what income level is implied by the regression line, you get that Cuba would be about 29% of the US as income or GDP per capita back in 1957. If you do the same thing for cars, you get that Cuba would be about 42% of US income per capita. If you look at the female life expectancy, you get 43% of the US. And if you put in the internal the infant mortality rate, you get a whopping 73% of US income. Cuba had in 1957 a first world infant mortality rate. So here's the basic model that I have in mind. The first equation I have up here is what I call the structural model. We think of an index, say life expectancy, to be a function of income, which would be Y. Actually, things are in logs, but I don't want to say logs all the time. Maybe some prices that affect that index, and some country characteristics and an error term. Now, I can't observe prices. And in fact, for now, at least, I'm using very little in the way of access, but let's say we can observe prices. So if we take prices out of here, if prices are uncorrelated with Y and X, which is unlikely, but if they are, then incorporating the lack of prices into the error term will not change these coefficients. But if they are, they'll give rise to different coefficients. So this equation here, without prices, is a non-structural model, but it gives you some sort of it's a statistical model that we can use for the estimation process. And here's going to be the procedure. Let's say we have some country J, in this case it's going to be Cuba, whose income is missing. And let's define this indicator variable that takes on the value 1 if the country if it's country J, 0 otherwise. Then this equation up here, this statistical equation, can be rewritten this way. For income, we put in the income whenever we have it, and for the country that income is missing, we treat income, or in this case, it's going to be actually the log of income, as a parameter to be estimated by the model. So now we have here a system of equations, each one having a bunch of countries, Each equation corresponds to a different index, and they all have in common. I actually labeled it here. This is a typo in the version that I put up here. This should not be indexed I, it should be indexed J, because the income is the same across all the equations. So we have here a nonlinear system of seemingly unrelated equations, where this parameter stands for the income of the country for which income is missing, and therefore it gets estimated in the process. So, what are the results for Cuba? Results for Cuba are the following. This variable I call income elasticity is really sort of a pseudo income elasticity. It's this parameter theta, which tells you what the sensitivity is of that index to income. And here's what I got for Cuba. These are all the equations from phones over to calories. And here's that parameter theta. It always takes on the sign that you would expect. For good things, it's positive. For bad things, it's negative. The t values are extremely high. The r squares range from pretty substantial sizes from 0.52 to quite high numbers of 0.83. And the log of GDP per capita for Cuba is this one, which translates into an income per capita for 1957 of 43% of the US level. Even higher than than John and Marianne's than the WD estimate, but far higher, almost 2.5 times or so higher than the relative number given by Madison. And the standard error is this one right over here. Now, I did the same procedure for every other country in the data set, excluding Cuba, and I did it, one by one. So I did it for like 120 equations, and so each equation would give me an estimate of the income for that country, and then I can compare it with the Madison number and see if, in fact, this procedure gives me a reasonable estimate or not. And it turns out that it did. The mean log GDP per capita using the Madison data set, the ones that they actually report, was 7.926. The mean of the estimated value was 7.924. So this procedure seems to give you consistent and probably even unbiased estimates of the income. What's more, the estimated values explain about 80% of the variation in the log of GDP per capita in Madison. So, this is not a bad estimate, assuming that the Madison data is perfect. Now, I also constructed 95% confidence intervals, and I did it 2 ways. One way is to use this standard error to compute the 95% confidence intervals. Another one was to take the actual empirical distribution of the estimated incomes versus the Madison ones, take those errors and compute an empirical distribution of error terms and construct 95% confidence intervals given those. In both cases, the Madison number which was quite a bit lower, the Madison number is outside the 95% confidence intervals, while the WD estimate is within the 95% confidence intervals in both cases. What's more, when you look at the error terms from this procedure, I don't detect any sort of obvious pattern. This is versus log of income. The error terms seem to be pretty evenly spread out. And then finally, I did one last procedure. This one I did not include in the paper that I sent to John or that I uploaded. And I had my doubts about this procedure. What I did is I took the income reported in Madison, or in other words, the log of that, and I regressed it on my estimated log. Now, when I first, and then what I did is the following. I said, based on that, then, what income does it predict for Cuba? And here I put the Cuban data set in red so we could see it. The predicted income for Cuba is that it's actually 35% of the U.S.'s GDP for that year, or in other words, exactly the number that John and Marianne got for Cuban consumption. And the reason for that is, if you look at the equation, I don't know if you can see with the small lettering here, the equation up here, when you regress Madison onto my estimates, the coefficient is it doesn't go through the origin. It has it's slightly, R-score is very high, but it does have a deviation from 1 here, and in fact it's significant. So at first, I sent this number by a text to John because I thought it was so close to his. Then I had second thoughts, and I thought I had made a stupid mistake, because you certainly don't want to be regressing the dependent variable on the independent variable, sort of a reverse regression as having any meaning. But then I realized that my estimates didn't come from a regression. It wasn't the left-hand side of a regression. It was a very different process. So I think this may be, in fact, a legitimate way of estimating it. But at least I didn't include this in the paper yet. Now, I think there's several reasons to believe that this method is going to give estimates that are closer to John's than they at first appeared. First of all, this method really is a way of looking for internal consistency in a set of income or GDP numbers. And to really properly compare the two papers, or the two data sets, John's and Madison's, we really would have to apply this technique to John's numbers for the other countries too. That's something I haven't done yet. And I also would like to do in the future is to apply it to a third data set, a neutral sort of data set, the Penn World Tables, that does not provide estimates for Cuba. So that's in the future to be done. The other point I wanted to make is that socioeconomic indices should be more related to income levels than to GDP. And of course, GDP and income tend to be similar across countries, but some countries they differ. And I gather from John that in Cuba's case, they may be more separate than, more different than you would think. Furthermore, you probably want for a lot of these indices more of a measure of permanent income than, or what amounts to the same thing, consumption, than current income. So I think it's not surprising that, in fact, John's estimates for consumption are much closer to the ones I'm coming up in this paper. And of course, the point that I made before that the WD estimates are conservative. So the fact that they're on the low side compared to my estimates is also, to be expected there. I have, sort of a lot of things to do in the future, but let me make the following point. I had originally, let me see if I can, hold on a minute.
Give plenty of time.
No, yeah, let me just pin right here. I have planned the following. One of the reasons why I took so long in coming up with this, revised version of the paper is that I spent several years, myself and some students, going back to hard copies of things like the national, the United Nations statistical reports and annual reports and stuff like that to come up with these numbers. And I wanted to expand the number of countries as much as possible. And when I got to especially poor countries, especially in Africa, a lot of those numbers are very difficult to come up with. They require interpolations, they require projections from nearby countries. It's a real mess. And sometimes it'll take you days to get one number. And that's taken a long time. And after, when I started to finally write this paper, I realized that may not be the best strategy, because what I'm doing is I'm using a linear in logs approximation to the relationship between the indices and income. And that approximation is going to be better if we restrict range to income to countries that we believe are going to be close to Cuba. So the effort may have been wasted in terms of getting a good estimate for Cuba by spending all this time trying to construct numbers for a lot of poor countries. That data may be useful if you want to get a picture of what the whole range looks like. But if we're interested in just one country, maybe having a smaller set of more accurate numbers across more indices may in fact be a better procedure. And if that's the case, I can probably proceed with that, fairly quickly. But there are other ways of dealing with these issues. Among them, I can also try to see of a method of estimation that's more like unbalanced panel equations, whereby you have a different number of countries in each equation, which right now I don't know how to do, but that's another possibility that we can do in the future. All right, John, I think that's.
Hey, thanks, Louis. I think they have turned on my screen. Can everybody see that? Can you see my
Yes.
slides? Okay.
Yeah, now we can see you. Yeah.
Okay. I am sorry for. Okay. So the relevance of this picture will be clear in a second. This is sort of a night lights picture of Cuba versus South Florida. So what the paper does, to summarize, it uses various economic indicators to have a short-run estimate of Cuban GDP. But I think the paper is much more general than that. So I'm not really going to discuss Cuba till I get to the very end. I think the paper is very clear. It's elegant. It's a very big improvement on previous work. And as I say, when emphasize, it's applicable outside Cuba. So what my comments are going to do is I want to discuss some general issues with shortcut estimates, and then I'll return to the Cuban case. And I think here's the background. Since economists invented GDP or became a sort of Kuznets in the late 20s, early 30s, people have been doing shortcut estimates. There was a guy called Bennett, who was a very important scientist in other ways for food, was in the 1930s with quantities. There was a guy called Wilfred Beckerman in the 1960s. There was Alan Heston, who created the International Comparison Program and the Penn World Tables in the 70s. And there's a big recent literature on luminosity, okay? And this is Henderson, the AER, very widely cited. There is also a big recent literature on China saying, are they cheating with their GDP? And there was, since Hamilton, people have been using this to determine CPI bias, okay? And of course, there's a Cuban literature. I was once at a conference where a guy described and sort of, he was a historian of the Ottoman Empire, and he said every sort of library he ever went to, every sort of, he would found, Bernard Lewis's name had been there first. And for everything to do with Cuba, Carmelo and Jorge Perez Lopez have done something. So they did something, a sort of shortcut sort of estimate in the 1985. People with very different views, Andrew Zimbalist in 89, Cajal and Sanchez, Nicholas Sanchez in the ASCE proceedings. And I think a very important article that had big influence was Smith and Lawrence. And Lewis, as he mentioned, the earlier one. So there's a big literature. And so what's the basic idea of all this literature? The idea is that GDP for many countries is often not available, or it may be extremely poorly measured, as in most of the African countries. It can be distorted, perhaps in Cuba, perhaps in China, to exaggerate growth. I mean, there's a literature, I think it's coming out in the JPE, where dictatorships tend to overstate growth. But if we believe that growth is correlated with other variables, right? And here's a luminosity. This one picture you've seen. This is South Korea, and this is North Korea. Lights, and say if we can use this to predict GDP for North Korea. Okay, and so. And there's a big recent literature on Twitter luminosity, right? And it turns out that there is information in this, okay? But all of these literatures from the 1930s to now have run into big problems. And Lewis mentioned one of the problems with his work on remittances. There are large standard errors. I mean, that seems to be the big problem. And so the literature start off at high expectations, and then they run into problems because it turns out that they have wide margins of error, more than people initially expected. And Lewis has gone through some of the reasons, okay? And so I just picked out that he's in his presentation, he mentioned that the proxy variables, there's no theoretical basis. I think Lewis says, I will get to that in a second. And there's also quality differences. And Kuznets initially noted this about these kind of studies in the 50s. And Lewis also mentioned it very clearly. There's problems with functional form. When you start using countries in Africa to sort of impute income in Cuba, there's a problem there, okay? And I want to illustrate it with a very simple example. We don't have many laws in economics, but one law we do have is from Ernest Engel. The idea is that the share of consumption devoted to food falls with income, right? This is one constant of consumer theory. And there's just a staggering amount of work in this. And there was a guy called, well, actually, not, he's a well-known guy. Since working and Leeser, economists are pretty much, they agree on what sort of functional form the food chair has. In fact, this functional form forms the basis of Angus Deaton, the almost ideal demand system. This is, we have theory, we have functional form, and there's a big literature on this. So this would be the best possible indicator you could ever ask for. And we have data on this international. I just took them from the 211 round of the International Comparison Project. This is consumption, PPP adjusted. This is food share, okay? And you can see immediately, if you take, say, a food share of 30 and try and estimate what your income is, you're going to get wide error bounds, okay? Now, part of this may be measurement error, part of it may be omitted variables, but I just think it's very difficult using one variable to form a good estimate, okay? So then I would say there are three issues with this, with sort of the shortcut socioeconomic indicator. The first one is variables. You have to have some reasonable justification. And this is where Lewis's work comes in. You can't rely on one indicator. If you do a lot, how do you combine them, right? How do you combine sort of the estimates? And this one is, which I will talk a little about, is about measurement error. So what Lewis does is, and he does a very good job, all the estimates here make sense, okay? He doesn't have steel, cement production, population density, irrigation, sort of variables that other people use that maybe not make much sense. And the quality variables is not, I mean, cars in Cuba were bigger than elsewhere, but they're not. Phones in Cuba, for example, were limited. They had price controls, right? But other than that, you don't see quality difference, which bedevils other estimates, okay? And now life expectancy, the functional form may not, logs may not work. So now I think all of this works. I mean, these are good variables, makes sense. There's some kind of background theoretical about it. Now, in passing, I wish Lewis had collected for his earlier study, he did US state variables. I think that would be very interesting. Where Lewis's contribution comes in is he combines estimates in this is very elegant. And we all like Arnold Zellner, right? This is a very nice, okay? What I was surprised in is the upper and lower bounds are very far apart. And I'm not sure I understand why that is, because if you use these sort of other approaches, you don't get as large. But I think now, looking at the estimates, what I should have said earlier on, there are at least 3 people listening to this who have a good idea what Cuban relative income was in the 1950s, since they were there, right? So you have some kind of internal sort of priors on this, okay? Now, what Lewis sent me some stuff, so I was able to do this, or what Lewis's estimates are very reasonable. For example, this is what the Madison, and I should be embarrassed here because I am actually, anyway, I'll leave that. But the Cuba is the same as Brazil, El Salvador, Panama. These make no sense whatsoever, right? No sense. I mean, it's not possible. Whereas Lewis's rankings are very sensible. It suggests that Cuba was a middle-income country, same as Ireland, Argentina, Italy. Those were middle-income countries in the 19th. So Lewis's rankings, I think, are make perfect sense. So I think that we're all Bayesians in a sense, and I say some people in the audience have a stronger priors than I would have, that these estimates make sense. Now, one issue that I'd be a little bit worried about is measurement error. There are big errors in the sort of Madison estimates of income. Lewis uses this functional form where income is here, right? And the measurement error will bias the coefficient, okay? I wonder if it's possible to use an alternative, right, where income is the, and I know that is right, and at the very minimum, right, there'll be less measurement error. And second, you can form a maybe upper and lower bounds, right? So if you take measurement error, you may want to change functional, right? And that's pretty much it. I mean, I think it's a very elegant, it makes sense. It's a big improvement. And notice how nice it is. Lewis has one number that he can evaluate the entire, for a year, the entire sort of Penn World Tables, the entire Madison, and he can pick out large outliers. This is a very nice result. Now, this is not, I think this is the least important one, is Cuba. Okay, I just want to talk a little bit about it. Lewis uses the Madison project. There are a couple of things to remember about Madison. First of all, they use 1990 prices, okay? And they use something called Geary-Thomas price index. This values income at this values GDP at American or rich country prices, which leads to much higher income levels for poor countries, okay? Whereas what Mary and I did years and years ago, we used a Fisher ideal. So what you see is for the Madison, Chile, all of those countries, they're much higher income levels than the Fisher ideal, okay? And of course here, Cuba is crazy. I mean, it just makes no sense. And I just one last slide, but I think this is not a problem with the Lewis's paper. Or after all, I think rather than evaluating Cuba, right, and it's really it's providing an approach to use a shortcut to do sort of say, are the estimates in a place like the Penn World Tables or Madison consistent? I think there are a lot of problems with these estimates, so it's very nice to have this. So one final thing about, okay, a guy called Harry Oshima, which is a very good national income accountant, actually estimated food shares for Cuba in 1953. And we have very good food shares for data of the middle income countries, right? And you compare that sort of what we did for consumption years ago, you'll see they're exactly on a straight line. But having seen the earlier diagram, you know that's random, okay? But it just shows how you can be fooled by sort of by chance. That's why you need to use more one indicators, okay? Now, when we were doing this paper, we ran into a problem. that it was very difficult to publish anything on Cuba if you said that Cuba had sort of incomes of a certain level. So what Lewis said, we did a very conservative estimate. So what I did is last night is I redid them. I just did sort of what I thought were sort of normal, right? And so what you get is sort of nominal income. This is the what we did in years ago, and then I revised it, right, to just say updated, updated some new data. There was actually a spreadsheet error, one of those famous spreadsheet errors as well. And so what you get is if you revise it, it's a third of the US. But if you put it in US prices, which is more comparable to Madison, then you get 38%. Okay, so not off, but there are big margins. There are margins of error in these issues. So we'll never know for sure what relevant income was for Cuba. What Lewis, I think, has done is, and he will continue on that, is given us a very simple, elegant, and appealing way to cross-check standard estimates, and that is all I have to say. Has anybody in the audience, would they like to make any comments before we continue?
I think that your comments were incredibly extensive, so you cover all kinds of things that, and what I know one paper that you mentioned, the Cahill and Sanchez, because I did a comment, I wrote a comment on that appeared in the papers and proceedings, and they use factor analysis to get their results. And I think Louis' method is far better than not only the use of factor analysis, but the things that get included and excluded in Cahill and Sanchez. But these comparisons are really very difficult. And I think your point about simplicity is really important, because you can never control for all the things that differ between countries. It's just a fool's errand. I'll stop there.
Any more? I think you're muted, Louis.
There we go.
Okay.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Unfortunately, I missed part of your comments because I was knocked off the internet.
Oh, Lord.
It's surprising I haven't been knocked off before here, given how we have a third world, we envy third world internet service at my house. So I'm sorry I got knocked off there, but what I did hear, I did appreciate a great deal. I'll be back in touch with you about that, especially the sort of like the literature review of things to mention of what other people have done. I think one reason why the estimates are have as big confidence intervals as they do is because I'm using the whole range of countries in the world. On the upper end for 1957, the US is such an outlier that, it messes things up there. But on the other end, all these African countries, they're all over the place. So when you look at, in indicator by indicator, the log smooths it out a bit, but nevertheless, at the low end, there's just a lot of variation going on there. So I think if I do narrow it to a smaller range of countries with better data, I think the confidence intervals will definitely come down. But it's still going to be significant, though. Yeah, it's still going to be significant.
Okay, if it's okay, so what I want to do is we have 30 minutes left. Since I'm the residual claimant, I will try and get my paper done in 20 minutes and give Louis some time for talk. So this is the paper. Okay, this is the capital. The reason the Cuban capital, the reason I do that, I will come to that in a second. I mean, I have done some of these things before. So I want to say, why did I write this paper? Okay, here's the reason. In July, during the protest, there was a webinar by a number of very prominent Cuban American, mostly academics. And I listened to it, and a day later, or a little bit later, Nicholas Sanchez from ASCE wrote a letter to the president of Florida that Carlos Siegel was kind enough to share with me. Now, I'm not sure I agree with Nicholas and what he said, but it struck me that there was some things that the people were saying about the Cuban past that I didn't recognize. The second reason I read it is that when thinking about it, I think my opinion on a lot of these things have changed about Cuba. And I think my opinion about the importance of income and stuff like that is maybe less important to other aspects, more sort of broader measures of welfare. Okay, now, and so what I do is I just say, look at the beginning of the Republic to now, right? I use sort of a measure called the Human Development Index. I'm not wedded to that, but it's a useful way to sort of bring in sort of broader issues in. You don't want to sort of end with this, but it's a useful way to begin it. So what's the basic idea? Is that history matters. And if we understand what the past, it'll help us understand what's going on in Cuba now. And of course, you never, all these things are very depressing. So I want to end on an optimistic note. And I will end sort of this guy, Nathan Nunn, who claims that, that the past is important, that institutions continue on, okay, that persistent, okay. So what is in the paper, okay? So what I do is, so summarizing. Some of you will all know this. The summary is very simple, that the Republican Cuba had reasonably high living standards, but there's more to this. It was the first tropical country to achieve middle income standards, okay? It was, it was, along with the Southern Cone, it was the richest Spanish society for most of the 20th century, okay? But I think there's something important that I think that I've missed in that. The underprovided education and healthcare, right? And I think that's very important, okay? And then I turn to the revolution after 1959. Here, I think there's a real puzzle here. The puzzle here is that growth is so slow, since growth in other communist countries was actually quite reasonable. And this is from Mansur Olson. I may have actually got this idea as Cuba as a stationary bandit from Roger Betancourt. He may have either told me the idea or turned me on to Mansur Olson. So here's the puzzle. The elites did not invest in growth, but they did invest in education, okay? Now, all of this requires a background, and the background is the following. Cuba, and I think that this is where it's sort of, I find it strange that other social science historians are not emphasized this enough, that Cuba started off at the 1900s, sort of somewhere, in the top 15 or 20 economies. Okay, since over that period, for some countries like Korea, Taiwan, income increased 30-fold. Italy, 10-fold. The US, I think 7 or 8-fold. Okay, Cuba doubled. This is the lowest, third lowest, pardon me. Only North Korea updated and Syria have done worse. Whatever the quality of the data, this is clear. Right? There is no other country has behaved like this. Argentinians in particular are familiar about talking about their decline, right? But this is nothing. Argentina is nothing like Cuba, right? So the reversal of it is unique. Okay. Now, since I'm short of time, I won't spend that much of this, right? So what I look at is Cuba through all these years. I try to do it through the Human Development Index. We want to have something more than income or consumption. We want to have sort of capabilities, right? A broader measure of welfare. And that requires life expectation, expectation of life and years of education. Okay. I say this is the Human Development Index. It's a geometric index that I use consumption. Other people use income. I think consumption is much better for Cuba or any planned economy. Healthcare is proxied by life expectation of life and education, which is the average years of education. And you have to bound it between zero. This, I think, is best seen as an ordinal measure. You can measure countries at a point in time. I mean, economic historians use it to compare countries in, say, the Central African Republic in 1870, the US now. I'm not sure that makes sense, okay? And now, talking about the data. So what I do is I have measures of consumption for these years, for 3 years for the Republic, 5 years for the Revolution. After 1880, the data is pretty similar. Before that, I use some of my own estimates. There are some technical issues that I won't go in. The one thing to notice is that you have to have consumption. It has to be household consumption. You have to include education and healthcare provided by the government, and you also need to include housing. If you don't, you get into big trouble. So I try to do that, and the results can be summarized very, very easy. Okay, this is the ranking of Cuba, and remember, the data covers all the rich countries earlier on, right? And Cuba is a relatively middle-income country. Cuba's relative ranking in the world for consumption, and its ranking for the Human Development Index, which includes education and healthcare. So you can see early on, Cuba's in the top 20. It stays at the top 20 for consumption 1955, and then with the revolution, it declines. Now it's somewhere around the 1990s. We don't know for sure. Our estimates aren't good. Maybe Honduras, maybe Guatemala, maybe Vietnam and Asia. Okay, so this is Cuba's reversal of fortune for consumption. All right, here is the Human Development Index. You can see for the Republic, their healthcare and education is lower than its income would suggest. Okay, but that ends somewhere around 1980. After that, their life expectancy or education are higher than its income would suggest. Okay, and so I want to talk a little bit about that, and I'll start off with the Republic. I think it's really worth emphasizing, right, that until that Cuba was maybe not a middle income, maybe a lower middle income country. Okay, first of all, Cuba achieved its rapid growth, which was pretty much from the foundation of the Republic till the early 20s, to the activities of Cuban entrepreneurs. Maybe they were born elsewhere, but they were Cubans. Cuba, in that sense, was a diverse country. And it's sort of Alan Dye, the historian of the sugar industry, makes that clear, but so does Oscar Zanetti, right? It's the Cuban society was remarkably dynamic. It was the first tropical society to have middle income standards. I think this is a big deal if you're an economist, given the debates between Acemoglu, right, and that on whether tropical countries were handicapped by institutions or that. Okay, and Cuba and the Southern Cone were the wealthiest Spanish-speaking societies until the late 50s. Okay, and I don't want to spend too much time on that. There's a lot of evidence on that. There is the evidence that I'll just mention briefly is wages. Because sugar was such an important policy area for the US went out and collected wages for sugar industries in Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Louisiana, and Cuba. What you'll see is that the Cuban wages are well above Puerto Rico, well above Louisiana, and comparable to Hawaii. I think that's remarkable. I should also say something, nothing to do about this paper, is that Cuba has remarkable sugar industry since Afro-Cubans and non-Afro-Cubans worked together, right? It didn't happen in Louisiana or didn't happen in Hawaii. So there are other things, but I mean, you just look at, and there are a lot of data. Cuba was by the 1920s was a middle income or lower middle income country. I don't think it had early prosperity. Okay, this is sort of unfair, but I'll say it anyway. If you read recent history on Cuba by American academics, you will not ever get that sense. For Michael Bustamante, who's now head, I think, of the Cuban agency at the University of Miami, has a book on sort of exiles without ever mentioning maybe they weren't that crazy. Maybe their income levels in Cuba were not incredibly low. But anyway, in some sense, that's an unfair comment, but I'll make it anyway. But I think that's something that I think I did not realize properly, is that Cuba failed in very important ways, and particularly in education. In 1953, 25% of Cubans were illiterate. This is a shocking number, right? By the 1900s, in a place like Ireland, which was lagged Western Europe, it was 10%, okay? Now, with life expectancy, it's hard because Cuba is a sort of, was a tropical society. But I think in some sense, we've been fooled by looking at Cuban infant mortality numbers. And I'll get to that in a second, okay? So what I'll do is just to make that point, and I want to give Louis time for his comments. You can see this clearly in years of education. I just compare Cuba, Argentina. I'm sorry. What I should have said is that Cuba differs from the Southern Cone in this respect. When the electoral franchise in Chile, Uruguay, and Argentina increased, their spending on education and healthcare increased. But we don't see Cuba making up those lags. Okay, this is the years of education for Cuba, Argentina, and Ireland. I took Ireland because it's kind of a laggard in some respects on education. So you can see that Cuba and Argentina start lower. Argentina regained some of that, but Cuba, till the end of the Republic, had very low levels of years of education per person, okay? For life expectancy, it's much harder to say, right? Because Cuba was a tropical country with very different sets of diseases. What you see is this remarkable thing. Between 1940 and 1955, the Cuban life expectancy went up by 17 or something. Incredible, okay? But it turns out that we have sort of a comparison. Puerto Rico had the same life expectancy as Cuba for as long as we have data, up till about 1940. And so what you see is, and Cuba and Puerto Rico were approximately the same age in the 1950s. By the end of the 1950s, life expectancy in Puerto Rico was about 6 years higher. So they applied the drugs, the public health developments, all of that better than Cuba did. So maybe Cuba lagged in healthcare as well. Okay. Now, so God, I gotta hurry up. So summing up, it was a middle-income country. It underprovided. Why? I mean, you say, why did the elites underprovide education? Maybe healthcare. Was it racism, urban bias, other reasons? Like, that along is a real puzzle of the Republic. So I want to get quickly to the revolutionary economy. Now, and here I was very influenced by this guy, a very interesting guy called, it's more sort of reference in political science now than economics, Mansur Olson, okay? And his point that he applied to the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe is that once a regime is stable in power, it has an incentive to stimulate economic growth. In the Soviet and Eastern European case, these were flawed economies, but they did have real economic growth. Now, I will leave outside from, so if we see Eastern Europe in the Cuban mirror, we have this big puzzle. At least my guess from the early one, impressive thing about Cuba in a depressing sense is how efficient their policing is, how they were able to squash dissent so quickly, right? So you can imagine that by the mid-60s, they were confident that they would stay in power, okay? Yet, unlike Eastern Europe, they did not grow. They didn't virtually grow at all. In fact, Cuba is the slowest growing communist economy in the world economy from 1950 onwards, okay? It occurred, they were completely in control. And you can see this in the GDP numbers, GDP per capita. You can see that Eastern Europe, and this is also true for the Soviet Union, grew continuously, and it is real growth, okay? There is the first student of Milton Friedman was a guy called Warren Nutter. Warren Nutter did a lot of work on the Soviet Union. His biases may be in a certain direction. He also said that there was genuine growth in the Soviet Union. We know that in the 1930s. We know that right, in their ability to defeat the Nazis. They had productive capacity. So the Eastern Europe sort of reaches the halt around the limits perhaps of factor of capital accumulation. Cuba grew by 25%. Eastern Europe grew by 100%. You can see it after the fall. After the fall, the reduction in income is much higher in Cuba than Eastern Europe. Plus, unlike Vietnam and other countries, they did not reform, right? These are stationary bandits. The Vietnamese saw the benefits to the regime of growth. So in the Olson sense, it's a positive, okay? Now, what they did do is they invested in education and healthcare, okay? And again, quickly, since most people are aware of that, they started at years of education below Eastern Europe, and I aggregate using population weights. They're now about the 7, but income is very different. The life expectancy starts 4 years before below Eastern Europe. Now it's above. And look at Puerto Rico. It's for a lot of the period, they had higher life expectancy than Puerto Rico. Now they're a little bit below, right? And I think there are there are problems with these measures because of certain, Cuba exaggerates because they not fake, I'm sure that's a harsh word, but their infant mortality numbers may not be, make sense, okay? But it overstates, but I think it's clear. One interesting thing in passing is that Cuba is not exceptional for education. The poor ex-communist countries of Uzbekistan, Georgia, Tajikistan have much lower life expectancy, but they have similar years of education. Communist regimes provided, even ex-ones provide education. Okay, now, and so here is the final, right? Here's Cuba now, relatively high HDI. Here's the US, the enormous gap. So summarize, okay? If you had to take away from this paper, say maybe three things. That first of all, I think, is that Cuba is remarkable. This drop in its living standards, there's no other example of this in the last century. And the second thing is, I think for me at least, there are paradoxes. Why did the Republic neglect education? I pulled it up this morning, but I don't have time to go through it. If those of you who remember the 1940 Constitution, it's actually it's a lot of it about education and minimum amounts to spend on education. Okay, the revolutionary country a government invested in education, but alone of all communist countries, they do terrible on economic growth, right? And they don't reform. Okay, and so the explanation of this is why. Okay, and were they a stationary bandit? There's two explanations. One is that they are not a stationary bandit. Their expectation of their survival was low. I don't believe that. The second one is that if they believe they reform, they would lose control. Anyway, I want to also say that the HDI leaves out, and this is the final tragic aspect of the Cuban story. This is the measure, it's called Policy Measures of Democracy. And you can see that Cuba is okay, under the sort of the Republic, not great, but it's not terrible. And then it falls, right? And this is where Cuba finally departs from the Southern cone, right? There is no move towards democracy, okay? And one final thing, what I think this tells us is that institutions or politics are central, right? This is the central thing, right? And I think understanding, if you want to understand the Republic, why on earth, were those failures? If you want to understand the prospects of reform, you say, why have they not reformed? Okay, if you want to end on a positive note, right? And the positive note is this, that Cuba once was an incredibly dynamic place. Before the wars of revolution, Cuba was what? The first railroad in Latin America. And we're not talking small railroads. We're talking 600 kilometers. By the 1900s, electric railroads in all major Cuban cities. This is another sort of extraordinary thing, how the sugar expanded into Eastern Cuba. This is a remarkable story with big changes in that. And also, Cuba had one of the most devastating financial crises in history in the 1920s. They recovered remarkably so, right? And so Cuba, or Cubans, or some Cuban institutions are remarkably dynamic. So if you want optimism, say if there are reforms, maybe things will go well. Okay, Louis.
Okay. The host has disabled my screen sharing. All right. Well, I guess I'll have to.
I know the feeling.
Yeah, I'm sure you do. Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll have to just talk through it. I don't have much time, as you know. I only got about I think 8 minutes or 6-7 minutes. I think it's I really like whenever someone is able to give a new perspective on a well-known pattern, a historical pattern. I think that's always really interesting. That's what John has done here. This notion of thinking of the Cuban government as having underinvested in health and education in the early period and the Republican period, and then overinvested in the revolutionary period. I'm not sure I completely agree, but nevertheless, I think that's a really nice perspective on it. I don't have time to talk about the HDI. I'm glad John is not wedded to it. What the line I have on my notes, which you cannot see, is the escrowable, worth and good for nothing HDI. So that kind of tells you what I think of it. I think it is not useful. And I think if John takes it out of his table, I'm not saying he should, if he takes it out of his paper completely, it would not at all change any of his conclusions or any of his presentations, since he's actually relying on the underlying indices for that matter. I think life expectancy, I'm not sure how good it is at capturing investment in health. Things like hospital beds, dentists, physicians, things like that are available probably for a while back, which are more direct investment measures. Especially in the recent period, life expectancy becomes problematic. There's significant Peltzman effects and other things going on there that I don't know what the heck it means. But just consider the statistic. In the US, Hispanics have a life expectancy that's 3.1 years higher than white non-Hispanics. And this has been so, and John knows it because we had a paper presented at UM 30-something years ago where I pointed this out. And yet no one would argue that reflects that Hispanics have a far better healthcare more investment in their healthcare in the US than white non-Hispanics. But nevertheless, even if you take that going on, what I did is I took my data set that I had and I looked at life expectancy And I estimated a simple regression. And the countries that I included were the Latin American countries, except for some reason I forgot Paraguay. I included Spain just because it was, and I included other countries in the Caribbean that I had in my data set, which only amounted to Jamaica and Barbados, and I also included Puerto Rico because I had data on that. And what I found on that, which you can't see unfortunately, is that for 1957 at least, Cuba is actually a positive outlier. It's not as big an outlier as, first of all, the English Caribbean and the countries of the English Caribbean and Puerto Rico and Spain were higher than Latin America. And among Latin American countries, two of the biggest outliers were Costa Rica, which we know has historically invested a lot in these public health measures. And the other one that was kind of interesting was Panama. So, let me just, so Panama was I presume because of the American influence and the canal, also kind of a positive outlier, but so was Cuba. So this thing about perhaps low life expectancy may well be a Latin American thing as opposed to a strictly Cuban thing. When I looked at education, I found the same pattern. Cuba was actually above the other Latin American countries. It wasn't the highest above. Again, Panama and Costa Rica came in higher, but it's true that it looks like Latin American countries would tend to be low relative to Puerto Rico, relative to Jamaica, and relative to Spain, given their levels of income. But sticking to life expectancy, actually Cuba was, in terms of education, was right out on the line. But in terms of life expectancy, it was above it. But another thing I did is I looked at urbanization as opposed to income, and what I found was that countries that I found that for life expectancy and education, there was a strong connection between urbanization and levels of life expectancy and education in Latin America. I once gave a public lecture where, ironically, where John is teaching now, many years ago, where I argued that from its very inception, from the colonial period, Spain and Portugal sort of established these colonies as extractive colonies with one central location. And what I thought has happened in Latin America versus the US or Canada is that you got political and economic power concentrated in urban areas, and usually in one urban area in many cases. And this led to very huge difference between urban and rural. And if you look at things like, the Southern Cone, for example, versus Cuba, one thing that's really dramatic is, forget about the tropics and everything else, is the rate of urbanization. Cuba had 40-something% rural in 1957, while Argentina and Uruguay were in the 70s and up to almost like 80% urban. Very, very different patterns. And the fit is quite good for Latin America. And of course, one thing that's happened in all of Latin America, but in Cuba especially, is the big increase in urbanization. Urbanization has gone up in the Southern Cone too, but not nearly as much as it's increased in Cuba in the revolutionary period. Now, well, I think I'm out of time anyway, right? Should we continue, John, or how do we?
Maybe a minute or two, Louis. So,
okay, let me just say that, so I'm thinking that really what I'm seeing here is what John may have pointed out is really a Latin American more pattern than it is a strictly Cuban pattern, at least in the pre-revolutionary period. As for the post-revolutionary period, look, let's look at the Human Development Index simply because there are a lot of people who look at things like that. They cannot increase, they cannot behave as a stationary bandit for reasons I can talk to John later on in more detail. But the problem is that these countries face a trade-off. And once they're stable, stability usually refers to not being subject to external threats. Once they're stable, the only threats can come from internal. And internal control is not consistent with any sort of an open economy, a well-functioning economy. They have to be restrictive in this sense. And so I think what you find from, it's just 15 minutes remaining, John.
Okay.
So I think one thing that that happens is that, and I had a student do a dissertation on this with applying it to ancient China, is that you're faced with this trade-off. Cuba, for example, is not going to be able to improve the economic side in the absence of subsidies from external, from outside. It's not going to be able to increase consumption or GDP or anything like that. Things like life expectancy, they've already gone to the point where any marginal contribution from any sort of investment is small. In fact, much of the improvement, as I've shown in other papers, has been just as big elsewhere in Latin America and in much of the world. Even infant mortality rate, as much as the infant mortality rate has fallen during the revolution, it fell more in absolute terms and in relative terms in the 50 years before the revolution and the 50 years after the revolution. So there's not much they can do there. So what can they do to make themselves look a bit better? They can focus on whatever other indices people look at. And one of the things that remains, for example, if you look at the Human Development Index, and that's one of the reasons why it's so misleading, is education. Education is perfect for a communist country. They don't have to produce anything of value. They just have to have people in school. And they can rack up, it doesn't matter whether people are learning art history or whether they're learning medicine and then becoming taxi drivers. It doesn't really matter because that's something that they can actually produce. It's not an output, really. It's an output only, we think of it only an output in our countries because people don't go and spend years of education, given that the foregone opportunities are costly to them, unless they have a decent return. But that's not the case in Cuba. And so that's one thing they can rack up. When people were looking internationally at the infant mortality rate, they did whatever they could by hook or by crook to get that number down too. But for example, no one was looking at maternal mortality, so they let that be, at third world levels. And so I think it's not so much that they are investing so much in these other areas. It's that those are the one things that they can do that makes them look quite better. If you look at that slide that you gave of the Human Development Index by income, I mean, the Human Development Index by its name supposedly says something about human development. And does anybody really think that Cuba is right there at the very top, near the top of the world? That makes no sense to me whatsoever. In any case, I think that the story that you're finding in the earlier period of the revolution, I think is more of a Latin American story than just a particularly Cuban story. And, we can discuss that a little more later. Thanks.
Okay, anybody else have any comments?
Yes, I have two. One with respect to the earlier period is in the 1930s, Cuba experienced a period of constant revolution. And that was very destructive. And that was followed for an immense amount of corruption. The Minister of Education in Cuba left Aleman with millions of dollars to Miami that he stole from school systems. And so I think that the point of urbanization is true. One of the greatest politicians of the 1950s became great arguing about the corruption where they were stealing the educational funds from the rural areas, particularly from the rural areas. And that was partly the source of his popularity, Eduardo Chivas.
Yeah.
So your finding is very consistent with these factors about Republican Cuba. With respect to the second period, the revolutionary period, there are the comments that Luis made, which make a lot of sense. But in addition, all of the things about the HDI ignore the interactions between the components. You cannot decrease the material consumption or fail to increase and continue to increase the other elements of the Human Development Index, education or healthcare. There's no surplus to provide education and healthcare if your economy is not functioning. And so the sustainability of any of these indices is in doubt. Your paper says the very long run. Well, would you make the same conclusion if it lasted another 10 years of the same mismanagement that has taken place for the last 60? They cannot provide the same levels, so something has to give unless it's manufactured arbitrarily using the tricks that Luis Lokai was pointing out. You can put people in the schools, and even if they're not doing anything, they can. And so anyway, and finally, there's a group of economists that are extending the HDI to everything. So including Miles Kimball. I don't know if you've seen the work by Miles Kimball. There are papers by Miles Kimball that in the last 5 to 10 years, extending the notion of the HDI to a new welfare measure that includes things. And so instead of having 3 main indices, you now have like 122 or something like that. And so you might want to take a look at that literature.
Okay.
Thank you for a great paper.
I just
what Roger just said about the corruption in Cuba is of course perfectly right, but I suspect that a lot of stories like that are probably pretty common throughout Latin America in that period.
Yeah, a quick reply. Cuba is more rural because manufacturing industry in Cuba was in rural areas. The sugar factories had to be right there. And I think that's make a big difference. And I think the Latin American comment is exactly true. What Latin Americans did is they tended to underprovide primary education. You had sort of a lot of, but they actually had a lot of university education.
Yes.
Cuba, that's a big deal. Remember, a certain politician was Castro was it was a product of that strange system where they had a lot of university education and not much, a lot of high school and much grade. And I think, look, the Southern Cone in Cuba are very different from the rest of Latin America, very different from the rest of the Caribbean. I think they're much more. I would compare them much more to Iberia. Anyway. I think unless anyone else was saying, I think we're done. Thanks everybody for
let me just say one last thing, John.
Sorry, Louis.
John, let me just say one last thing. The point is that it matters because even though industry may have been in rural areas for Cuba, because a lot of this corruption, the corruption is going to take place on public monies. What is public money going to be spent on? Oftentimes education and healthcare. And if you're stealing, it's much easier to steal from the rural areas if political power is all concentrated in the urban areas. And if you're more rural, there's more possibilities for that corruption to manifest itself.
But I think there are other things going on. And Cuba is the
maybe
one of the Southern Cone that had a large Black population. right? I mean, income distribution,
Yes.
there are many things going on.
Sure, there may be.
Right.
Sure, there may
In terms of the HDI, of course, I don't believe the HDI, but I think it's when you say to people, say the HDI, people realize that you're talking about things other than income, and that's the only thing for the HDI. But anyway, again, thank you everybody for coming. I think we don't want to go too far over our line. Okay, so thanks everybody for a good session, and thanks everybody for their comments.
Thanks, John.
Okay,
Thank you, John.
thank you all. So Louis, your screen was frozen. Isn't that strange?
What happened? No, I wasn't able to share because I think, remember when you did something to be able to share the screen?
Right. I know.
I think you took away my power to share.
Yeah, before my power, I wasn't able to share. So it was anyway.
And now I'm not able to share.
I know. Very strange.
I put a little effort into making up these cards for you. Anyway, we have to let's set up. I mean, let's talk sometime. Yeah. When do you want to? Yeah.
The other Louis, I will send you my comments. I think Louis may have already. Louis may have.
Oh, yeah, he already left. I think he already left. Yeah. John, let's talk about. We can have our own Zoom conversation sometime about the paper. Okay.
Sure. Let's do that.
Okay. I'll be in touch. Bye.
Okay, Louis.
Bye.
Bye.
Happy New Year, Roger.
Happy New Year, to
Roger.
you guys. It was a great session.
Yes.
Ya.
Fui a Safeway porque así no me tenía que mojar. Sí, probablemente pagué más, pero
Y no importa, Alicia, vaya.
el poder no tener que mojarme.
A mí, o caminar por lugares que tengan hielo.
Sí, vaya. Así que nada.
Yo creo que a mí lo de hielo no te importa tanto como mojarte, pero a mí la idea es que te vuelvas a caer. No me hace ninguna gracia. 36 grados, slowly.
Y decían que estaban contando ahí la gente, decían, I guess everybody has decided because it's raining, everybody has to come to the grocery.
Porque estaba grado.
¿Puedo poner la mesa?
Coño, pero para empezar a poner en otro lado, ¿no? El piso no es más fácil. Una vez que las pones arriba, entonces yo creo que sé que iban a guardar, empezar a cocinar. Ok. Te ayudo a sacar las cosas, tú quieres cocinar.
Pero sácala y pon en su lugar.
No, yo no sé su lugar, por eso es.
Esto para la nevera. Esto para la nevera abajo. Esto para la nevera abajo. Me parece que aquí te va a caber todo mejor que tú no vas a ver.
Tú también vas a la nevera abajo. Maybe spinach.
Pon esto ahí. Esto para abajo.
Meterlo dentro de eso. Con fuerza. No vas a botar. Los bien los quieres aquí, los quieres.
Ah, aquí en la nevera. Eso.
Aleluya.
la quedó.
Fantástica.
Pero bueno.
Sí.
¿Cuánta gente se apuntaron?
Había como 10, entre 8 y 10. Por supuesto, no creo que en este momento no sé, no sé todo lo que está. Veía los nombres de la gente entraba y se iba. Y éramos. Ya sé que estuvo, pero. No no me parece porque no digo nada. Es incapaz de estar y no.